For my fellow Shopify theme developers out there, tell me if this sounds familiar. Shopify releases this new theme called the Dawn theme. It's replacing the previous debut theme, and it's touted as the epitome of what Shopify are calling Online Store 2.0. Of course, you dive into the theme code to have a look, and you find this. In the debut theme, there was just one JavaScript file. It took this object-oriented approach to organizing theme code with functionality split up by section, each section created as an instance on the theme.Sections object. But the Dawn theme's JavaScript was totally different. I'm not gonna lie guys, I had no experience with web components before I opened up Dawn for the first time and I saw that class component name followed by the extends HTML element and I was like, huh? But the discovery of web components in Dawn sent me down a rabbit hole to learning more about web components, to the point now that I've created a whole Skillshare class on the subject. In this video, I want to give a quick introduction to web components in the Dawn theme, and provide a resource for you to learn more about the web component meta specification in general if you want to go more in depth. Sound good? Sweet, let's get started. So I'm going to start off this tutorial right here on the Shopify theme store. I'm on the page for the Dawn theme. And if you want to install this theme directly onto your store now, you can just click start with this theme. But if you created a Shopify store after June 2021, then you probably already have Dawn on your store already because it is in fact the default theme now. Okay? The reason, however, why I wanted to start here is for this section. If we scroll down, look at these tabs here, click on support and documentation, and then scroll down to release notes, here we can see what the latest version of the Dawn theme is. And if you look at these dates, it's changing quite rapidly. I actually prepared the material for this video a few days ago and it was only on 4.0.0. And now looking at it on this particular day for you guys, it is now at version 5.0.0. So it's crazy, it can change within a few months to a whole new version. So it's important if there's discrepancies between what your code looks like and what my code looks like, it probably comes down to this version number right here. So check whether it's actually at version 5.0 because you might be watching this well into the future. If it's not, then there will be some differences between my code and your code. All right. How you can download the latest version of Dawn is just to go to the GitHub page. You can go to github.com/Shopify/Dawn, and here should have the most up-to-date code. What you can do is you can just click on this green button here, and then you can click download zip. That will download the theme zip, which you can then upload to your store, or you can expand it and look at the files, which is what I've done right here. I have opened up Dawn version 5.0.0 in my code editor, which is Visual Studio Code. And what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go through the web components in Dawn and talk about the specifics of how Shopify have used web components in this particular theme. Before we do that, I want to give you a quick lesson on what web components are so that you can identify them when you jump into a new project, just like this Dawn theme. So what I'm going to do is just create a new file here. I'm going to select the language of JavaScript. And how you identify a web component is like this. It's going to look similar to this every time you see a web component. So it's going to start with the keyword class, and then it's going to have the name of the web component in camel case. So the first letter of each word capitalized, but no space in between them. And then you're always going to see extends HTML element. All right. Then we're going to open up that code block, and in here you're going to have a constructor function. And in this constructor function, you're going to see the super method, which calls the constructor of the class that it's extending. Now, a little disclaimer, guys, this is probably on the more advanced end of JavaScript. So if any of this doesn't make sense to you, maybe you want to dive deeper into web components, you can check out my Skillshare class, which goes into 2.5 hours of content on web components itself. So I encourage you get your head around web components before you start to fully work with them in themes like Dawn and other projects. That's exactly why I created a comprehensive Skillshare class for you guys. Anyway, moving on, what we will usually see after this is using that constructor class, we're going to define a new element. So let's just say our element is web component. and then we put in that class name here, okay? Then in your HTML, this is not a HTML document, but in our HTML, we can call that web component by just going like this, okay? And then whenever we write this in our HTML, what's going to happen is this class is going to be instantiated and this constructor is going to run, okay? So any code we put in here will run when we include these HTML tags for our custom element on the page, okay? So web components might take some time to get your head around, but essentially all that happens is you've got this class and then you've got this constructor method, which always runs when the web component is created in memory. But then what you can do is create methods on this web component, and you can call them from outside the web component or inside the web component. So I could, as we'll see in this video, have a show and hide method. You can pass arguments in here, but basically this is the format, right? We just got a constructor method and then a list of other methods that we create ourselves. The cool thing about web components is that we can reference the this keyword, and the this keyword refers to the web component itself. So say for instance we had a web component tag like I showed you before, and then inside it we said hello world. We could actually access the inner HTML of that web component and console log it like such, right? And so when we include this on the page, we will get a console log with the inner HTML, which is going to be hello world. All right, this is a very, very fast primer on web components. I definitely recommend you check out the Skillshare class if you want to go deeper into this, if you don't quite understand a web component. But that's all I'm going to leave you with here for the quick tutorial on web components. Now that we know how to identify web components, let's actually have a look at the web components within Dawn. All right, so I'm going to close this down. We don't need to save that. And I'm going to open up our Explorer here. And the folder that we're looking for is the assets folder. That's where all our JavaScript is going to be. Global.js is the file with the most amount of web components out of any of the other JavaScript files. But as you can see here, there is lots of other code other than just web components. What we can do to identify a web component is just to look for that syntax that I just showed you. So the class, the name of the component, extends HTML element. And here you can see we have found our first web component. And underneath here, you can see that we're using that class to define a custom element. If I then grab this, and then I go over here to search our code base, let's put a less than sign in front. You can see that we're using this quantity input custom element in 3 different places in our code base: on the featured product.liquid, the main/cart.items.liquid, and the main product.liquid. Let's just click on one of these, and you can see here that we have some inner HTML in here, but the functionality of this custom web component is controlled right here. Now, what I'm not going to do in this video is go through a deep look at all of the 30 web components within Dawn. That would just take too long. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the most notable things that I noticed about web component design within the Dawn theme. First of all, I want to just take a look at this particular web component because I think it's a really good example of some of the principles that are followed in Dawn. As you can see here, we've got our constructor function, and then we've got a method here. And this method is actually an event handler method. We can tell that by the keyword on. This is not a keyword that's set in actual JavaScript. It's more of a convention that developers use to distinguish an event handler. And as you can see here, we're feeding that event handler into this event listener. But essentially, yeah, we've got a constructor function, which we're always going to have, and then our methods here. Now, bringing our attention to the constructor function, what I like about how they've done it in Dawn is that they store the reference to elements that they need to use in this code in a web component variable. So we can actually create a variable on the web component by putting the this keyword dot and then putting the variable name. So instead of making multiple references using query selector, we can store it in this one web component variable, and as you can see, we can use it throughout our code. The other thing to note within this constructor is it's a good place to set up our event listeners. So as you can see here, we have set up an event listener on every button. On the button click of any button, we are then going to run this event handler. And the reason why we need to use .bind this is so that this here represents the web component and not the event itself. Okay, so you're going to see this quite often in Dawn, an event handler, and it's always going to bind to this so that we can continue to use the this keyword to reference the web component itself, just like we've done up here. So this is an approach that I would recommend as well in web components. Put your references to particular elements that you need to use in your code in your constructor, and set up your event listeners here in your constructor as well. And also put in your event handlers as methods on the web component. I think that's a very solid approach. And of course, this theme was developed by Shopify themselves. So if they've done it this way, then that's a really good indication that this is a good way to write your web components. If we scroll down here, we can look for some other web components. All we got to do is look for that extends HTML element. So we can see here a new one. This is menu drawer. And again, I'm not going to go into the actual details here because this is quite detailed and would make for a very long video. But as you can see, we've always got our constructor function, and then we've got all of these methods. If the method starts with on, then chances are it's an event handler. And as you can see here, that's what we've got here. But then you've also got other methods that will do stuff like close menu drawer, or close submenu, or close animation. Okay, this one's a quite complicated one. That's the menu drawer. And what you'll notice with the custom element below it is you can actually extend other custom elements that you created to leverage the functionality that you already created within that parent web component. So as you can see here, we're not extending HTML element anymore. We're extending menu drawer, which was the web component that we created just above here. So we're taking that menu drawer functionality and we're extending it with a new web component that takes advantage of all the functions that we already created in menu drawer here. All right. So it's not always the case with a web component that you're extending HTML element. You could extend another element such as, a built-in HTML element. You can extend like a HTML button element, for example, but then we have to put in an extra argument in. If I scroll down to the define method here, you have to actually put in an extra argument here, which I cover in the Skillshare class. Otherwise, you can actually extend classes that you create yourself like we are doing here. So it's not always extends HTML element. You can create web components extending subclasses of HTML element. Moving on here, one of the cool things I noticed that Shopify have done with their web components is, let me just try and find an example for you. I think if we go into, here we go, pickup availability. One of the cool little shortcuts that they've done is they've put the whole class declaration inside the second argument. So remember beforehand, if I just go back to, let's put this in place. If I go back to global, you'll see we create the class up here, and then we put it as the second argument in the define method. They've kind of like shortcutted it here and put that class declaration in the second argument here without actually creating a variable. So that's something you can do as well. And then what they do is they check whether the web component has already been defined by using this get method. That's going to get any custom elements by the name of pickup availability. If it comes back undefined, then clearly it hasn't been defined yet. So then we'll go in and define it right here. I thought that was pretty cool and tricky by Shopify. So that's an extra option there. And the other thing I found interesting is in the facets file here, in facet filters form, is the use of static methods here. Static methods actually are called on the class itself and not the instance. There is a subtle difference between classes and instances. And if I understand correctly, the reason why they've done that is because they might have multiple instances of facet filters form on the page, and therefore they don't want to call these methods on multiple of the same web component within the code. The reason why there is multiple facet filter forms, if we actually look inside the code base, so I'm going to find where is our define method? Here we go. Facet filter form. And if we find that being used in our HTML, I'm going to put the less than sign there in front of it. And if I have a look at facets.liquid, you can see there are multiple places where we are using it. As you can see, some of them are for mobile and some of them are for desktop. So if my understanding is correct, the reason why, if I scroll back up to facets.js, the reason why we are calling the method on the class here and not the web component itself is because we've got multiple of the web component on our page. That was another interesting thing that I saw Shopify do with web components in this theme. The next thing I want to talk about is how HTML and CSS are handled via web components in the Dawn theme. And the interesting thing is that the shadow DOM is not used in any of these web components. So the shadow DOM is one of the 4 specifications that make up the web components meta specification. I have a whole lesson on shadow DOM in the course if you want to check it out. But essentially how we would create a shadow DOM is by running this attach shadow method. And as you can see, if I search the code base, there is no attached shadow. If I search shadow root, which is the way we can access our shadow root, there are no references to shadow root either. So there's actually no use of the shadow DOM within the Dawn theme. Just briefly, in case you have no idea what a shadow DOM is, it's basically another DOM subtree that you put inside an element, and that's separate from the main DOM. And what that means is if you put CSS in the main DOM, it doesn't actually apply to the shadow DOM. Okay, so again, if this doesn't make sense to you, jump onto the Skillshare class and I explain it in depth there. So that's kind of how styles are handled inside of this Dawn theme. As there is no shadow DOM, then it's just handled like a normal HTML element. Speaking of which, where is the HTML stored in these web components? If I go back to, let's go to global.js. And in my course, I talk about 3 different methods of setting HTML. We can set the HTML within a web component explicitly by just going .inner HTML. And then we can assign a value to the inner HTML. As you can see here, what this is doing is setting the inner HTML of a web component to empty. As you can see here, there's a few other references to it, but we're not actually putting full-on HTML. If I look for the start of an opening tag, you can see, at least in global.js, we are not setting the HTML explicitly through a string on any of these web components. So how is HTML coming through these web components typically in Dawn? Well, there's actually 2 ways I've seen it done inside this Dawn theme. The first method is by using templates, and the second method is by using the section rendering API and then parsing that returned HTML. So let's have a look at each of these. If I go into here and look for a template tag, you can see that a template tag is used in collage.liquid, main/product.liquid, and a few more. All right. If I click on any one of these, you can see here our template tag, and we've got some inner HTML inside the template tag. Now, what a template tag does, for those of you who don't know, and this is covered in the course as well, is any code that's put inside those template tags does not get rendered in place in the HTML. But what you can do is make reference to the code within this template tag, and you can utilize that in different ways. So the way we can utilize that is, let's have a look for a reference to template. And as you can see, if I go into global.js again, we can see here, now this might look a bit complicated for a first-time viewer, but what we're doing here is we're looking up the template tag, we're grabbing its content, looking at its first element child, and grabbing that as a new node and appending it to the content here. So if we look through other examples in our code base, you can see here we have a similar thing going on here. You find the template code and you grab its content and then use it in your JavaScript rather than rendering it in place. That's essentially what a template does. So I noticed in the Dawn theme, it uses templates in a few different places, but the other way that web components in Dawn handle HTML is via DOM parser. So if I go and search the code base for new DOM parser, and let's have a look down here at facets and close this down. Here you can see that we've got this function here called render product count. And if I look for where that's called in the code, you can see it comes from a fetch response, and then we grab the HTML from the response and then pass it through to render product count, which if we have a look at, So I just have to scroll down here. We are going to take that HTML, throw it in render product count, and then parsing the response string, we can actually grab elements off of that parsed HTML and then grab the inner HTML of that and then use that in our code. So this is what we covered in the previous video on section rendering API and bundled section rendering API. Once we've got our HTML returned from the API, then we can parse it and we can grab certain elements within it, and then we can put it into our code and use it somehow within our web components. These two methods of bringing in HTML into our code base, either by parsing HTML return from an API or using a template tag, if I go back to that example again, are both two ways I cover in my Skillshare class. Again, I keep referring to the Skillshare class, but if you actually want to understand web components, I definitely recommend taking it. I wish I could go into full depth of everything going on within the Shopify Dawn theme in this video, but it would just take too long and a lot of it wouldn't be relevant to you. What I want you guys to understand is the fundamentals. That's what I always try to get you to understand on this channel. I want to give you a fundamental understanding of how these things work so that you can figure them out for yourself. And for me, looking at all of this code in the Dawn theme for the first time, it was quite overwhelming until I took a step back. I addressed my gaps in my knowledge and I figured out how web components work. And now I can come back to the Dawn theme and understand what is actually going on here. And once you understand how web components work, it's actually not that hard to understand everything that's going on. And it starts to make sense why web components have been used in the Dawn theme to begin with. All right, I'm going to leave the video there, guys. A bit more of a complicated one. We didn't go full in-depth into understanding everything that's happening in the Dawn theme. But if you're serious about learning web components, which I recommend you do if you want to keep working with these online store 2.0 themes, I recommend you check out my new Skillshare class, which I will link in the description for you to check out. Skillshare usually has a deal that you can get a free trial if you sign up as a new member. But of course, remember, for my Patreon subscribers, you guys get access to all of my Skillshare classes. So that is an option as well. If you want to join our mastermind community for Shopify theme developers, definitely check that out. I'll put the link on your screen now. Until next time, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video.